Cheyenne Mountain, the fortress of last resort. The year is 1957. On October 4th, the Soviet Union launches a small metal sphere into orbit around the Earth, and everything changes. Sputnik was not a weapon. It was a satellite, a beeping metal ball weighing 83 kilograms, transmitting a radio signal that amateur operators around the world could pick up with ordinary receivers. In itself, it did nothing threatening, but what it proved to the engineers and strategists who spent the weeks after its launch working through the implications was something with a very specific military meaning. If you could put an object into orbit, you could put a warhead onto a ballistic trajectory that would bring it down anywhere on Earth. The age of the intercontinental ballistic missile was not coming. It was here. The United States had built its air defense system around a different threat: Soviet bombers. The logic was sound in the early 1950s, when bombers were the primary delivery mechanism for nuclear weapons. Long-range aircraft approaching North America would first be detected by radar stations positioned in the Arctic, the distant early warning line, then intercepted by fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missiles. The warning time was measured in hours, not minutes. Hours were workable. You could scramble aircraft, issue alerts, move key personnel to protected locations, make decisions. Intercontinental ballistic missiles changed the arithmetic completely. A missile launched from Soviet territory followed a trajectory that would bring it to its target in approximately 30 minutes. The radar systems designed to detect bombers from several hundred kilometers away could detect an incoming missile. But detection, tracking, and the transmission of warning to the command authority that needed to act on it would consume several of those 30 minutes. The usable decision time could be as short as 15 minutes. In some scenarios, less. 15 minutes is not much time to do anything. It is not enough to evacuate a city, relocate a government, or meaningfully disperse military forces. What it might be enough for, barely if everything worked perfectly, was to make the command decisions about a military response and transmit them to the forces that would execute them. But only if the command authority that made those decisions could be guaranteed to survive the first wave of incoming weapons, remain in communication with the forces under its authority, and continue to function with full situational awareness in the seconds after impact. For that to be possible, the command infrastructure itself had to be built for survival. Not survival in the conventional sense, hardened buildings, reinforced walls. Survival against megaton-yield nuclear weapons, which release energy in quantities that can flatten cities and transmit lethal shockwaves through the Earth for kilometers in every direction. The answer to this problem, after years of study and analysis, was to go inside a mountain. Not any mountain, the right mountain. And in Colorado Springs, Colorado, there was exactly the right one. Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs, Colorado, is a granite peak rising to nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, sitting in the interior of the continental United States at a substantial distance from both coasts. Its granite is among the hardest rock formations accessible anywhere in North America. The decision to build inside it, rather than simply near it or on top of it, reflected a specific understanding. The protection offered by the rock itself, its mass, its density, its ability to absorb and distribute energy, was the point. The mountain was not a backdrop for the facility, it was the facility. The engineering challenge at Cheyenne Mountain was not simply building something physically strong enough to resist a nuclear blast. It was building something that could remain functional with all its electronics, its communications equipment, and the humans operating it, after a nearby nuclear detonation had sent shockwaves through the surrounding rock. These are two different problems. The first is a problem of structural strength. Can the walls and ceiling withstand the physical forces imposed on them? Granite, the rock type of Cheyenne Mountain, handles this exceptionally well. It is among the densest and hardest materials in the Earth's crust, and in compression, which is how a blast wave loaded from above would stress it, it is extraordinarily strong. The mountain itself was not going to collapse. That was not the engineering concern. The engineering concern was seismic transmission. When a large explosion occurs near a rock mass, it sends compressive waves through the rock at high velocity. These waves travel outward through the granite until they encounter a boundary, a change in material, a void, a structure. At that boundary, the wave's energy transfers into whatever is on the other side. If that other side is a rigid building attached to the rock, the wave's energy goes directly into the building structure and everything in it: computers, communications equipment, people. The effect is not unlike a very severe earthquake. Things break, circuits fail, human beings are thrown off their feet and potentially injured. The solution the engineers designed was to make the buildings inside the mountain not actually touch the mountain. 15 freestanding steel buildings containing a combined floor area of more than 180,000 square feet were constructed inside the excavated cavern. Each building rests on a foundation of steel coil springs, 1,319 of them in total, each coil approximately 90 centimeters tall and rated to support 450 kilograms. The springs absorb the seismic energy that would otherwise transfer directly from rock to building. The buildings are connected to each other and to the utility systems by flexible couplings and expansion joints that can accommodate the movement the spring system allows. The result is that when a shock wave passes through the surrounding granite, the buildings move. They sway on their spring mounts. They can shift laterally by approximately 30 centimeters in a major event. But the energy that would otherwise damage the structure and its contents is instead absorbed and dissipated by the spring system, and the buildings and the people and equipment inside them experience the event as manageable motion rather than catastrophic impact. The cavern that contains all of this was created by removing approximately 700,000 tons of granite. The rock was blasted, broken, loaded onto trucks, and hauled out through the main access tunnel over the course of the construction project that began in 1961. What remained after that removal was a space large enough to house a small city, enclosed in one of the most geologically stable rock formations on the North American continent, with its internal structures engineered not just to survive, but to continue operating in conditions that would destroy any conventional facility. To enter the Cheyenne Mountain complex, you pass through a tunnel that does not go straight. The main vehicle tunnel, more than 600 meters from the outside world to the interior cavern, curves in an S shape rather than running directly to the target. This is not a design choice motivated by any geological constraint or by the need to navigate around a feature in the rock. The S-curve is a protective measure. A blast wave from an explosion at the tunnel entrance travels in a straight line at the speed of sound in rock. A curved tunnel interrupts that straight line path, forcing the wave to deflect off the tunnel walls multiple times before it can reach the interior. Each deflection dissipates a portion of the wave's energy. By the time the remaining energy reaches the main cavern, it has been reduced from potentially lethal to manageable. At 2 points along this tunnel, positioned to provide maximum protection, there are blast doors. Each door is 1 meter thick and weighs 25 tons. The construction is steel of the same quality and specification used in the hulls of naval warships. The comparison is not incidental. The people who designed the doors drew on shipbuilding expertise for the metallurgy and the structural engineering of the seals. When these doors close, they close completely, with tolerances that prevent blast overpressure from passing around the edges. They are closed by hydraulics. The hydraulic system can drive a 25-ton door to full closure in 45 seconds. The system is tested weekly, a regular maintenance cycle that cycles each door through its full range of motion to confirm that the seals are intact, the hydraulics are responding correctly, and the locking mechanisms function. In a facility where a door failing to close in a crisis would be catastrophic, The weekly test is not a formality. The protective specifications of the doors were derived from the Soviet nuclear arsenal as assessed by American intelligence in the early 1960s. The specific weapon systems, their yields, and the blast pressures that those yields would produce at various distances from the mountain. The doors are rated to withstand overpressure multiples of what any weapon in service at the time of their construction could generate at the distances involved. Whether that rating remains current as weapon yields and delivery systems have evolved is a question with a classified answer. Beyond the blast doors, the security architecture continues with layers that reflect the facility's sensitivity rather than its physical protection requirements. Biometric identification, access compartmentalization, and escort protocols ensure that physical presence in the tunnel does not translate to access to the command and control areas. The people who work at Cheyenne Mountain refer to the combination of the blast doors and the security systems as the airlock, a metaphor from submarine and spacecraft design that captures both the physical sealing function and the transition it represents between the outside world and what operates within. The Cheyenne Mountain complex opened operationally in 1966. From that day forward, it has never been unoccupied. The watch it maintains over the aerospace environment around North America, and increasingly over the orbital space above it, has run continuously for nearly 60 years. The core mission at the time of opening was missile warning. The command center needed to be able to detect the launch of Soviet ICBMs, track their trajectories, calculate their intended targets, and provide warning and assessment to the National Command Authority within the available time window. The data to do this came from a network of ground-based radar systems positioned across Canada and Alaska, supplemented by early satellite systems that could detect the infrared signature of missile launches from orbit. The command center that processed this data was built around displays and people. Large screen systems, the technology of the mid-1960s, did not yet support the kind of high-resolution, flat-panel displays we now take for granted. So the early displays were rear projection systems showing maps and tracks, presented the integrated picture to operators and commanders who had to read it and act on it quickly. The computers supporting these displays occupied entire rooms and would be outperformed by a modern smartphone in every relevant metric. But they were the most capable systems available, and the people who designed the facility built them in knowing that they would be replaced. The facility itself was designed to be upgradable, with the infrastructure to support more capable systems as technology developed. The human dimension of the mission is the part that is easy to underweight when describing the technology. The operators who sat at the displays in the command center had a job that existed nowhere else in the world. They had to evaluate, in real time and under time pressure, whether what they were seeing on the screen represented an actual attack on the United States or a false alarm. The consequences of getting this wrong in either direction were civilizational. Treating a false alarm as real could trigger a nuclear response that started the war the facility was built to help survive. Treating a real attack as a false alarm could mean that the National Command Authority received its warning too late to act. This decision, made over and over through decades of operational service by people sitting in a mountain in Colorado whose names were never public, is perhaps the most consequential recurring judgment that any group of human beings has been required to make in the modern era. The history of the Cold War contains documented incidents in which the warning systems produced anomalous readings that required immediate assessment. A flock of geese misidentified as incoming missiles in one case, a Norwegian scientific rocket briefly classified as a potential threat in another. In each case, someone in a position of authority had to make a judgment call in very little time, with imperfect information, about whether the world was about to change forever. In each case, they got it right. That track record, perfect over 6 decades, is the most important operational fact about Cheyenne Mountain. The design requirement for the Cheyenne Mountain complex was not just that it survive a nuclear attack, but that it continue functioning after one, for however long the situation required, without any resupply or support from the outside world. This requirement shaped every system in the facility. The designers had to think through the complete list of things that a functioning command center would need: power, air, water, food, medical care, the ability to maintain and repair its own equipment, and ensure that each of those things could be provided internally from stores or generating capability inside the mountain, without any dependence on infrastructure that might not survive the event the facility was built for. Power is the most fundamental requirement. Without electricity, nothing in the command center functions. The solution is 6 diesel generators of substantial size, maintained in dedicated engine rooms within the cavern. Each generator can operate independently, and the combined generating capacity of all 6 is sufficient to power a small city. The diesel fuel to run them is stored in tanks inside the mountain. The generators are maintained to a standard that allows them to reach full power output within seconds of being called on. There is no warm-up period, no delay between the signal to start and the delivery of power to the systems that need it. Water is stored in 4 underground reservoirs with a combined capacity of more than 22 million liters. This is not drinking water alone. It supplies the cooling systems for the electronics and computers, the fire suppression systems, the sanitation systems, and the personal consumption of up to 800 personnel. The reservoirs are fed from underground sources and are sealed from the surface, meaning that contamination events above ground, whether from fallout, from chemical or biological attack, or from the simple disruption of normal water supply systems, do not affect the facility's water security. The air system is designed around the specific threats of a post-nuclear environment. The outside air intakes are sealed by blast valves, large closures that can be triggered by the pressure wave of a nearby explosion to prevent the intake from transmitting that pressure to the interior. When sealed, the facility operates on internal air circulation. When external air is used, it passes through filtration systems designed to remove particulates, chemical agents, and radioactive contamination to levels that are safe for continuous human occupancy. The food supply is maintained at levels that can sustain the full complement of personnel for months. The medical facility includes surgical capability, not a first aid station, but an operating room, because the assumption built into the design is that the facility must be able to treat significant trauma without the option of evacuating anyone to an outside hospital. Dental care is provided for the same reason. A gymnasium and recreational spaces were included because the designers understood that human beings under prolonged stress in an enclosed environment need physical activity and structured decompression, and that the operational effectiveness of the command center depended on maintaining the mental and physical health of the people running it. The sum of these systems is a facility that functions on principles closer to a submarine or a space station than to any terrestrial command center. A self-contained environment that carries within itself everything it needs to sustain its function, because it was designed on the explicit assumption that it might one day have to. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the Cheyenne Mountain complex went into full lockdown for the first time in response to an actual emergency. The distinction matters. The facility had been exercised thousands of times: drills, war games, readiness assessments, and the personnel inside were thoroughly familiar with what lockdown looked like and what it required. The blast doors had been cycled through their test routines every week for 35 years. But the test is different from the event, and the difference was apparent to everyone in the facility that morning as the doors closed in earnest for the first time. What the facility was responding to in the first minutes was information that was still fragmentary and rapidly evolving. The first aircraft impact at the World Trade Center had been ambiguous, possibly an accident. The second was not. By the time the Pentagon was struck, the national security apparatus had shifted from a peacetime posture to a crisis posture, and Cheyenne Mountain, as the nodal point of North American aerospace defense, was at the center of that shift. The challenge facing the command center that morning was one its original design had not anticipated. The threat was not inbound from outside the aerospace perimeter. It was already inside it. 4 commercial aircraft had been hijacked, and the radar tracks of those aircraft were on the displays in the command center. The facility had been designed to detect threats approaching from outside: missiles on inbound trajectories, aircraft violating the airspace boundary, threats that originated from within the domestic aviation system, from aircraft that had valid flight plans and were already inside the defended zone, were a categorically different problem. The ground stop, the order halting all commercial aviation in the United States, was coordinated through channels that ran through Cheyenne Mountain. Clearing several thousand commercial aircraft from American airspace simultaneously had never been done before in the country's history. The communications infrastructure required to execute that order in minutes, reaching every relevant authority in the aviation system, was the same infrastructure that the Cold War had built for purposes that looked very different on that morning. The facility's performance on September 11th demonstrated something important about the nature of the investment that had been made in it over the previous 4 decades. The specific threat, Soviet ICBMs on inbound trajectories, for which every element of the physical design had been specified, never materialized. But the communications infrastructure, the command connections, the hardened and redundant systems that had been built to survive the worst case and continue functioning through it, all of those things proved directly relevant to a crisis that nobody had modeled when the facility was designed. The mountain had been built for one war. It was useful in a very different one. The broader significance of September 11th for the facility's institutional story was what it demonstrated about the value of infrastructure that had been built for one purpose and proved relevant for another. The designers of Cheyenne Mountain could not have modeled the specific scenario of September 11th, 2001, but the principles that shaped their design decisions: hardened communications, redundant command connections, the capacity to maintain situational awareness and decision-making authority in a crisis, proved directly applicable to a crisis that looked nothing like what they had anticipated. Infrastructure built to the highest standard tends to be useful beyond its original purpose. The mountain was no exception. Few military installations in the world have generated as much sustained popular imagination as Cheyenne Mountain, and the reasons for this are not hard to understand. The combination of elements is compelling in a way that transcends any specific cultural moment. A secret city inside a mountain, doors that seal the outside world away at 45 seconds notice, a command center watching every corner of the sky for the beginning of the end of civilization. These are the narrative elements of the kind of story that people have always found compelling. The hidden fortress, the last line of defense, the watchers at the edge of the known world. The Cold War gave that ancient narrative a specific, technologically credible form, and Cheyenne Mountain sat at the center of it. The 1983 film War Games placed a version of the command center on movie screens around the world, depicting it with enough technical and visual plausibility to shape public understanding of what actually went on inside. The film's central scenario, a teenager's computer connecting inadvertently to NORAD's war simulation systems and nearly triggering a nuclear response, was recognized at the time as technically implausible in its specifics, but emotionally accurate about the broader anxieties of the nuclear age. The film was widely seen, discussed at the highest levels of the Reagan administration, and has remained a cultural reference point for discussions of nuclear strategy and technology risk for 4 decades. The television series Stargate, SG-1, ran for 10 seasons using the Cheyenne Mountain facility as the fictional home of an interstellar exploration program. The Air Force cooperated with the production, providing access for location photography and technical consultation. The cooperation was not accidental. The Air Force Public Affairs apparatus recognized that a popular series presenting the institution as the guardian of humanity against existential threats was useful for recruiting and public perception, and the trade of some classified adjacency for widespread favorable portrayal was an easy calculation to make. The conspiracy theories that circulate around the facility, theories about concealed extraterrestrial technology, about secret programs whose actual purposes are unknown, about government activities conducted beneath the mountain that the public is not meant to know about, are the predictable response to a real institution that is genuinely secret about significant portions of its work. The secrecy is real, which means the theories that fill the space that secrecy creates are also real, in the sense that they reflect genuine uncertainty rather than pure fabrication. The mountain keeps some things genuinely concealed. Deciding what to believe about what those things are is a judgment that each person makes independently, with imperfect information, which is of course the situation that conspiracy theories are specifically designed to fill. What can be said with confidence is that the gap between what Cheyenne Mountain actually does and what the most dramatic popular accounts suggest it does is probably larger than the conspiracy theorists assume, and the gap between the public's understanding of its importance and its actual importance is probably larger than most people would guess. The Cheyenne Mountain complex was designed, in every specific engineering detail, to survive a particular threat: nuclear weapons delivered by Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, arriving on trajectories that would bring them to targets in the United States within 30 minutes of launch. That threat has not disappeared. The Russian Federation maintains a nuclear arsenal of a size and sophistication that makes the original threat calculation still relevant. The missiles are more accurate, the warheads are in some respects more capable, and the command and control systems on both sides have evolved considerably from their 1960s origins. The basic problem that Cheyenne Mountain was built to address, how to maintain decision-making capability in the face of a nuclear first strike, remains a genuine problem that the facility continues to address. But the threat environment has expanded in ways that the original designers could not have anticipated, and several of those new threats have added new dimensions to the case for the mountain's continued relevance. The electromagnetic pulse is the most significant of these. A nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude, above the atmosphere where the fireball does not interact with air in the normal way, produces an electromagnetic pulse that spreads across the Earth's surface below, inducing electrical currents in conducting materials that can destroy unprotected electronics at distances of hundreds or thousands of kilometers. The theory of this effect was understood in the 1960s, and the original design of Cheyenne Mountain incorporated EMP hardening. The steel structure and granite surround provide significant shielding, and the electrical systems were designed with suppression built in. But as electronics have become more sensitive and more pervasive, the EMP threat has been reassessed multiple times, and the conclusion that emerged from the most recent comprehensive assessments drove the 2015 decision to return critical systems to the mountain. Cybersecurity presents a different kind of challenge. The command and control systems within the facility are connected to the broader military communications infrastructure, which in turn is connected to networks with varying degrees of exposure to external interference. The specific approach the facility takes to managing this, which systems maintain direct network connectivity, which are air-gapped, and how the boundary between the two is managed, is not publicly disclosed. What is public is that the awareness of cyber vulnerability has led to a deliberate re-examination of which critical systems benefit from being maintained on analog or otherwise isolated platforms, specifically because such systems are inaccessible to network-based attacks. Hypersonic weapons represent the third major new threat dimension. Ballistic missiles follow a predictable arc that current radar systems are well designed to track. Hypersonic glide vehicles, weapons that travel at high speed within the atmosphere rather than on ballistic trajectories, capable of maneuvering and changing course in flight, present a tracking challenge that the radar networks and the software that processes their data were not originally designed for. The facility's sensor systems have been updated to address this, but hypersonic weapon development in Russia and China has been rapid, and the assessment of how well current detection capability matches the threat is a matter of ongoing analytical attention. In 2006, 15 years after the Cold War ended, NORAD moved its primary operations center out of Cheyenne Mountain. The destination was Peterson Air Force Base, a few kilometers east of the mountain, a modern, purpose-built facility that offered operational advantages over the aging infrastructure inside the granite. Running a full capability command center inside a mountain comes with operational costs that the above-ground equivalent does not. The spring-mounted buildings require specialized maintenance. The ventilation and filtration systems require regular servicing that is more complex inside a confined underground space. The access tunnel and blast doors require their own maintenance programs. The diesel generators, the reservoirs, the specialized power systems, all of it requires sustained investment to maintain in a condition where it can be relied on. In the mid-2000s, the specific threat that justified those costs seemed diminished. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist 15 years earlier. The nuclear threat was smaller and more diffuse than it had been at the height of the Cold War. The argument that the United States needed to pay the operating premium of a hardened underground command center to survive a surprise nuclear attack was harder to sustain politically and budgetarily than it had been in 1966. The facility was placed on warm standby, maintained in a state where it could be reactivated quickly if needed, but with a substantially reduced permanent staff. The critical systems were kept powered and tested. The blast doors continued their weekly cycles. The spring mounts were maintained. But the active command functions moved to Peterson, where they could operate more efficiently and at lower cost. 9 years later, the calculus changed. The 2015 decision to return critical communications and command systems to the mountain was driven explicitly by the EMP threat assessment. Peterson, for all its operational advantages, sits exposed on the surface. Its electronic systems are physically accessible to the electromagnetic effects of a high-altitude nuclear detonation in ways that the granite and steel of Cheyenne Mountain are not. As the assessment of EMP vulnerability across American military and civilian infrastructure was updated, taking into account both nuclear weapons and the electromagnetic effects of extreme solar activity, the unique protection offered by the mountain became newly compelling. The return also reflected a broader reassessment of the strategic environment. The period from roughly 2010 onward has seen a sustained resurgence in the strategic competition between the United States, Russia, and China that many analysts had expected to diminish after the Cold War. Nuclear arsenals have been modernized. New delivery systems have been developed. The threat environment that the facility was built to address has not diminished. It has evolved and in some respects expanded. The mountain that was built in 1961 as the answer to one specific problem has found itself, more than 60 years later, still relevant to a threat environment that keeps changing around it. Cheyenne Mountain does not protect a city. It does not protect a population, a resource, or a piece of territory. What it protects is something more abstract, and in a specific sense, more fundamental: the capacity to make decisions. This is a precise and important thing to build for, and it is worth understanding exactly what it means. The history of warfare contains many examples of fortifications designed to protect territory or populations: walls, castles, defensive lines, bunkers. All of those things are protecting something physical: land, people, material. Cheyenne Mountain protects a function. The function is the ability of the National Command Authority, the President, the Secretary of Defense, the chain of command they sit at the top of, to receive accurate information about what is happening, process that information, make decisions, and transmit those decisions to the forces that need to act on them. If that function is disrupted, if the command authority is eliminated or isolated from the information it needs, or cut off from the forces under its command, then the military capability of the United States becomes, in effect, a collection of assets that cannot be directed. The weapons exist, the forces exist, but the decision-making center that would coordinate their use has been removed. That is a specific and serious form of vulnerability, and it is what the Mountain was built to prevent. The Cold War strategic concept of deterrence depended on this function remaining intact. The theory of nuclear deterrence holds that a potential adversary will refrain from a nuclear first strike if they assess that the costs of such a strike, the retaliatory response they would face, outweigh the benefits. For that calculus to hold, the adversary must believe that the retaliatory capability is real, that it would survive a first strike, and that the command authority to direct it would survive as well. Cheyenne Mountain was and remains part of the physical foundation that makes the last element of that calculation credible. Its existence is part of the argument that deters attack. The broader lesson that the facility embodies about the relationship between physical infrastructure and strategic posture is studied at military institutions internationally. The specific engineering solutions, the spring mounts, the blast doors, the EMP hardening, the self-sufficient power and water and air systems, all of these are case studies in the application of engineering to the problem of institutional survival. But the more fundamental lesson is architectural. A command infrastructure whose survival depends on the same surface networks and systems that a first strike would target provides no real deterrence benefit. The value of the Mountain is precisely its independence from everything that might not survive. The blast doors open and close on schedule. The springs absorb what comes. The screens watch the sky. The Mountain has been keeping its vigil for 60 years, through the end of the Cold War that built it, through the attacks of September 11th, through the reassessments and the budget pressures, and the arguments about whether it was still necessary. It is still there. It is still watching. Some things are built for a specific moment. Cheyenne Mountain was built to outlast all of them, and so far, it has.